Arkansas has been a national transportation route in Colorado since the end of the last ice age. And it is probably quite natural then that railroads would find their early routes up the Arkansas or at least in the valley of some sort. And this evening we're just going to do a very short history of railroads in the valley. We'll focus more probably on the Santa Fe than the other lines, but I can talk a little bit about all of them. And we'll cover a broad time period, 1872 to 2014. The Arkansas Valley, east of and including Pueblo, has a very rich railroad history that's not well known. And I've spent a lot of time in the valley the last 20 years. I shared with some folks this evening that I attended the Santa Fe Retired Employees Picnic in Wahana in September. And I try to do that every year. It gives me an opportunity to touch base with a lot of the old timers, which their numbers are decreasing. This is all the major railroads that one time or another have been served the Arkansas River Valley from Pueblo to the east. The Kansas Pacific, Santa Fe, Missouri Pacific, Union Pacific, Denver, Rio Grande, Rock Island, Southern Pacific, Colorado and Southern, Burlington Northern, Denver and New Orleans, Colorado, Wyoming, Union Pacific, Denver and Gulf, Denver, Texas, Fort Worth, Denver, Texas and Gulf, Colorado, the CK, which is the Colorado and Kansas, and then of course today's Burlington Northern. Most of these lines never got east of Pueblo, but they were in and out of the valley at one time or another. Some of them probably are a surprise to you. Many at the bottom of the list down there couldn't even find corporate emblems for. They've been gone so long. That doesn't include the hundreds of paper railroads that were proposed in the valley at one time or another. So we're just going to focus on four companies. Like, by the way, there was at one time a proposed trolley line that was going to run from Canyon City, Colorado to Dodge City, Colorado. It would have gone down the north side of the valley. Just to give you an idea how many different companies at one time have tried to build here. The companies we're going to look at are the Kansas Pacific, the Denver and Rio Grande, the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe, and the Missouri Pacific. All of which none exist today, at least in their corporate names. They do exist in other formats. And we'll start first with the Kansas Pacific. It was the original company to build in the Arkansas Valley. In 1870, 1871, the Kansas Pacific, led by General William Jackson Palmer, built out of Kansas and through the central section. They actually entered the valley, or they were in one of the tributaries of the valley, Sand Creek. They came through Kit Carson, turned north, and ended up in Denver. And that line was completed in 1871. Shortly thereafter, this is a Kansas Pacific image showing what a homestead looked like out on the Kansas Pacific line in Colorado. A dugout, meat hanging on a rack to dry out. In the distance you can see a haystack with a fence built around it. This was open range, and so if you had a haystack and you wanted to keep it, you had to build a fence around it to protect it. Cattle ran free, and if they got into your hay because it wasn't fenced, it was your fault. It's probably still that way. During 1872 and 1873, the Kansas Pacific built a branch line from Kit Carson to West Los Animas. Don't be confused by the name. West Los Animas and Los Animas were separate places. The Los Animas that you know today is the West Los Animas of 1872. There was a lot of controversy about this line being built. The county had voted bonds to construct this line to Los Animas, but when it got close to being down to the valley floor, the railroad company decided that they owned some property of their own, so they decided to build their own community and bypass Los Animas, which they did. And eventually, old Los Animas, which was over near Fort Lyons, disappeared. And the new community replaced it. And of course, the railroad reaped all the rewards railroads because they got to sell everybody new town lots. This is very typical of railroads at the time. Oops, wrong way. This is what West Los Animas looked like in 1872. The railroad depot was actually the biggest building in town. The second railroad to arrive in the Arkansas Valley was General Palmer's Baby Road, the Denver and Rio Grande. And they called it the Baby Road because it was built narrow gauge. Railroad tracks today, standard gauge tracks, are 4 feet to 8.5 inches wide. There's all kinds of arguments about where that dimension came from. Some people say that it's the spread of a Roman chariot. It probably was caused by the fact that the first locomotives ever to be built by Robert Stephenson were for an old coal line in England, and that was the dimension of the track at the time. These are narrow gauge locomotives. The top one up there is the Montezuma, the first locomotive bought by the Rio Grande. It weighed about 25 tons. It could haul about 3 railroad cars. Sometimes people had to get out and push it because it was too heavy. The cars were so light that in a heavy windstorm they would blow off the tracks. The bottom picture down there is the Shabano, and that's a freight locomotive, and it weighed a massive 35 tons. And it was capable of pulling about 6 coal cars. And the Rio Grande built from Denver south to Colorado Springs in 1871 and finished its line into Pueblo in 1872, and then built west to the community of Labrum, which is today's Florence. The purpose of going to Labrum was coal. Coal was a highly sought after commodity even in 1872, especially by the railroads, because that was the chief fuel of most locomotives. The arrival of the Rio Grande and Pueblo was fairly controversial also because, like the Kansas Pacific, the Rio Grande also had a land company and formed their own communities. I always call it community abduction. They tried to siphon off the original communities in favor of their own property. And the third company to enter Colorado was the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, actually its subsidiaries. In Colorado, it was known by a number of names. It was known as the New Mexico and Colorado Railroad for a while. And another part of it was called the Pueblo and Salt Lake. And it was also known as the Pueblo and Arkansas Valley 1, 2, and 3. And then there was another piece of it that was called the Canyon City and San Juan. The reason why we had so many names under the Santa Fe banner is that they could utilize the bonding capacity of new companies. They could sell more bonds and more stock, make more money. And also, it got around some of Colorado's corporate laws at the time, allowed for a little bit more flexibility. And Santa Fe arrived during Christmas of 1872. Santa Fe was awarded a Kansas state land grant that required them to have their construction completed for the Colorado state line by January 1st, 1873. And the construction crew got to the end of track at the survey line that they believed was the state line on Christmas Day of 1872, and they basically released all their employees to go home. A day later, the government surveyor showed up and said, "Sorry folks, you're 3 miles short." Santa Fe immediately rounded up every man they could find. They went back. They'd run out of ties and they'd run out of rail. They went back into Kansas. They ripped out every siding that they could rip out. They hauled the ties forward, and on, December 30th of 1872, they finally reached the new state line. Well, it was the territorial line of Colorado at the time. And there they stopped for a while, celebrated for the rest of the winter. You've got a pretty good idea where the Santa Fe planned to go, though, by what they painted on their locomotive. This is the Pueblo, which Santa Fe owned many locomotives, and many of them were named in the early years. And to have a name, community name for a locomotive was considered quite quite an honor. By the way, there never was a Fowler. And here's what the railroad scene looked like at the end of 1872-73. We had the Rio Grande from the north, the Kansas Pacific went across the middle, the branch line to West Los Animas, and then a little piece of the Santa Fe built into the southern part of the state. Of course, Pueblo was the goal of all of these railroad companies. Pueblo had become the supply center for most of the southern part of the state. Most of the large commission houses, wholesale grocers, and merchants were located in Pueblo. They received most of their supplies by ox train from Kansas City. Everything was hauled overland at the time. Originally, Pueblo was founded in 1859, and it was north of the Arkansas River, as you can see in this picture. South of the river was unincorporated territory, and eventually the Denver and Rio Grande will build its own community there, South Pueblo. There was actually a third Pueblo too, called Central Pueblo, and all three of the communities were not united until 1889. 3 mayors, 3 fire departments, 3 police departments, 3 city courts, 3 water departments, 3 sewer departments. And basically it all had to do with our favorite topic, taxes. While we would have thought that the arrival of the Rio Grande and Pueblo would have resolved a lot of problems, basically it did not. It created a number of problems for the city of Pueblo. First of all, they had to deal with 3 different entities. There was the railroad company itself, which operated the trains. There was the construction company, which built the tracks. That was the North-South Company. And there was the land development company, Central Colorado Improvement. All 3 of them had one goal in mind, and that was to make their bond and stockholders wealthy. And so they manipulated every situation they could get into in order to do this. One of the problems centered around bonds. The community of, well, not the community, the county of Pueblo issued bonds to help construction of the Denver and Rio Grande. They issued $150,000 worth of bonds in one election and another $50,000 in bonds in a second election. The bonds had some key provisions. One was that the depot, a passenger depot, would be located within 1 mile of the county courthouse. When the Rio Grande arrived in Pueblo, it stopped for a day or 2, and then it continued construction until it crossed the Arkansas into the new community of South Pueblo and built its depot there, outside of the corporate limits of downtown Pueblo. But technically within the 1 mile required by the bonds. Palmer would become very famous for this, and it will cost him dearly over the years. The terminal facilities for the railroad were built in South Pueblo, and South Pueblo really began to siphon off a lot of Pueblo's trade. Eventually, the treasurer of the Rio Grande went to the Pueblo County treasurer to accept the bonds that were promised to aid construction, and the county treasurer refused to give them to him. And it went to court. It just so happened that the court was in the city of Pueblo, and they ruled against the railroad. And the bonds were never delivered. To give you an idea of the value, an $1880 today is $24. Pueblo is said to have voted more dollars in railroad bond money than any county in Colorado, and got less railroads for their money. And it wasn't shortly, by 1876, the state legislature took the power of bonding for railroads away from the counties. A lot of counties got themselves in a lot of trouble. Oh, also at this time, the real reason why the Rio Grande and the city of Pueblo came to blows was over predatory freight rates. It cost as much to transport a ton of freight from Kansas City to Denver as it did from Denver to Pueblo. Coal mined in Canyon City delivered in Denver was cheaper than coal mined in Canyon City and delivered in Pueblo. And this was done by General Palmer because he could. So you can imagine that the city of Pueblo, of course, was looking for some alternatives. two railroad companies stepped forward to offer plans. One of them was the Kansas Pacific. It offered to complete its line from West Los Animas to Pueblo. All they wanted was $200,000 in railroad bonds. And at the same time, the Santa Fe stepped forward with the Santa Fe plan. They would build their railroad from Grenada to Pueblo, and all they wanted was $200,000 in railroad bonds. The people of Pueblo were desperate, so guess what they did? They had two bond elections. In 1873, both the Kansas Pacific and the Santa Fe wooed Pueblo County. The county commissioners examined both railroad companies and found them both wanting. You have to remember that in 1873, the country is in the middle of a huge economic depression. The J. Cook Company has gone bankrupt. Banks all over the country are going under. Railroad companies are going bankrupt quicker than you can even count them. Anyway, on March 14th, they set a date for one bond election that was supposed to be in favor of the Kansas Pacific. A couple days later, they changed their mind and they gave the election date for the Santa Fe. Then they were told they were going to be sued by the Kansas Pacific, so they scheduled a second election on the 21st to vote bonds. Both bond elections, by the way, passed, but because of the Depression, the bonds were never claimed. We think financing is fun today.
What year was the first roundhouse put in? You know what year?
In Pueblo?
Yeah.
The Rio Grande Roundhouse, the original narrow gauge roundhouse, was built in 1872 after the first of the year. The second roundhouse, there's been three Rio Grande roundhouses in Pueblo. The one that the foundation still exists today was built about 1915. There was another standard gauge roundhouse that was located to the south of that one. The roundhouse foundation today is on the site of the original roundhouse, the narrow gauge roundhouse. The Santa Fe built their first roundhouse in 1876 when they arrived. Anyway, the folks in Pueblo decided to build their own railroad. And it was going to build either to Grenada to connect with the Santa Fe, or it would have gone to West Los Animas. Either way, it was going to pass through West Los Animas. The principal office of this new railroad would be in Pueblo, and they were going to issue $3 million in stock in small denominations so that all local people could take part in it. Kind of a pie-in-the-sky idea. I doubt there was $3 million in the whole state of Colorado. On January 4th, 1874, a petition by 100 residents, it only took 100 people to call for a bond election, was presented to the county commissioners for a bond for $350,000. The bonds had the same kind of stipulations as before. You had to have a passenger depot within a mile of the courthouse. The length of the issue would be 30 years. They would pay 8% per annum. That's pretty good money. The bonds would be issued in $100, $250, and $500 denominations so that a small person could buy stock if they wanted, or bonds actually. The bonds would be also exchanged later on for Pueblo and Salt Lake stock, making Pueblo County the majority stockholder of the railroad. And a unique feature of this bond was that as railroad construction progressed, the bonds could be sold, creating a cash flow, which in the past, bonds weren't turned over to the railroad company until after construction was completed. The bonds passed by a very large majority. Pueblo used to have massive firelight meetings down on Main Street. The whole community would turn out, and it was almost like Grecian democracy. Everybody in the community stood in the street and had a chance to voice their vote. Henry R. Holbrook was selected as the chief engineer of the Pueblo and Salt Lake Railroad. Many of you who are local probably know him by the Holbrook Canal and the Holbrook Reservoir. Also realize that Holbrook, Arizona is named for him. He was very famous in Pueblo. He had a corporate office there. He owned an opera house there at one time too. And a well-liked gentleman. In a leap of faith, they estimated it would cost $1 million to build the railroad from Pueblo to Grenada. And knowing that they only had 350,000, they were kind of at a loss exactly what to do. So they decided that they would grade the line, provide the ties for the line, and build the bridges, and then hope that either the Kansas Pacific or the Santa Fe would provide the iron. The iron being, of course, the most expensive part of railroad construction. Bids for grading and proposals for tying and building bridges were called for. And all of this activity made other people kind of nervous. One of them was President Thomas Nickerson of the Santa Fe. Nickerson seized the opportunity to kind of gain a foothold in with the Pueblo and Salt Lake crowd. He gave the Santa Fe's 1872 survey to them, which is basically where the railroad is today. And he entered into serious discussions with them about providing the iron. Thomas was kind of fuzzy. He was a Bostonian financier, in case you don't know who he is. On September 1st, 1874, bids were opened. All of them were rejected as being over the cost. The second set of bids went out, and the grading was eventually awarded to Ford, Carlisle, and Orman of Pueblo. And if you ever drive the seats of Pueblo, you'll know Orman Avenue, Carlisle Street. I don't know if Moore has a road or not. I don't think so. C.C. Welch of Golden got the tie contract, and we'll talk about it a little bit in a minute. And A.W. Grant got the bridging contract. All the original bridges between Pueblo and Los Animas were wooden trestles, wooden pile trestles, open deck. The first dirt was turned on the east side of Pueblo. They went outside of town basically because they hadn't decided yet where the depot was going to be. Depots are just crazy things with railroaders and communities. In the 1870s, having a depot was like having an airport. If you didn't have one, your community was going to die. Grading proceeded anywhere from 1/3 of a mile to a mile per day, which is very quick. Just to give you an idea of what they graded for, you had to create a linear platform 12 inches above the surrounding soil, anywhere from 8 to 12 feet wide. And that was dirt that basically was just thrown up. Compaction usually was done by mules and horses walking back and forth over the top of it. At the same time all this was going on, the Santa Fe chartered the Pueblo and Arkansas Valley Railroad No. 1, and they asked Benton County for $150,000 in bonds, which they got. Everybody wants to build a railroad. And at the same time, the Kansas Pacific began to get its ideas together about building west. The first grading was in September 12, 1874, of 4 miles. By January 1st, 1875, the line had reached Manzanola. By February 28th, it had reached what they call the Narrows, which is an area right along the county line between Las Animas and La Junta. It's an area where the south bank of the river, the south bluffs of the river, comes down fairly close. It becomes very tight in there. And there basically was only room for one railroad to be easily constructed. At the Narrows, the Santa Fe and the Kansas Pacific ran into each other. Both claimed a right-of-way through the Narrows. And the two grading contractors, or the two grading companies, basically ran into each other. You have to understand that most of the professional people that were involved with railroad building were well known to each other. Grading companies knew each other quite well. They hired each other's men when they were out of work. They socialized with each other. The engineers knew each other professionally. They were generally a little more educated than others. They thought of themselves as being professionals. They acted in a professional manner. And it wasn't unusual for two competing companies to sit down and have dinner together. It happened quite often. Not quite like what would happen probably today. The Battle of the Narrows was called Colorado's first railroad war. And when the two grading companies ran into each other, both had filed maps and documents with the General Land Office. We have a series of public laws in the United States called the Pacific Railroad Acts that governed how land could be used by railroads after the Civil War. And because railroads tended to take advantage of the public laws, the law kept changing. Whenever some company had figured out how to get around the law, Congress would change it to try to make it bulletproof. Never worked.